And Mr. Mehta, why don't you elaborate on the political economy of the budget and what does it do to our system? We can take 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes.
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Good morning. And it's wonderful to see everybody here. And I feel a bit like every year at this meeting, all my co-panelists have been wearing ties. And I used to be the odd person out. So this time I decided to follow them. And the opposite happened. Much like the way in which narratives about the economy change. So what I'll do is just offer some remarks for 10 minutes about how might one think of the politics of the budget insofar as there is any, and what perhaps it means for the future. The advantage political scientists have over economists is twofold. One, that we can engage in a little bit of speculation because politics is contingent. And two, we like conflict more than economists do, where in economics kind of all boats tend to rise kind of simultaneously. So the distributive questions are perhaps a bit more salient. I would begin by saying I think there are three large, background facts to keep in mind when thinking of this budget. I think the first, of course, the immediate political context was people were looking for whether there's going to be any, as it were, big bang follow-up to demonetization, right? And the blunt truth is that not only the government, but the economy also is very deeply tied in different knots. I mean, the room for maneuver isn't there. The big windfall that was supposed to happen from demonetization has not materialized yet and will not materialize, at least not in any visible, palpable way, right? A 1.5% hit to GDP, Dr. Manmohan Singh has been vindicated by the economic survey, which is perhaps still more conservative in the estimate, should have been an unconscionable crime in any other political society, but it says something about the nature of our opposition, that it's not been more, in a sense, more of an issue. And I think one has to say this, I think both intellectually and politically, we are in a very, very uncertain era. I think everybody wants the budget to be about jobs. But very frankly, it's actually not entirely clear what people are expecting by way of intervention in terms of job creation. I think if you look at the global debates intellectually, whether in the United States, whether in China, a lot of those debates are on a wing and a prayer. I mean, there is a sense that you do some things and jobs will follow. And reality is proving a lot more recalcitrant to the project of job creation. I mean, I think that just is a fact, right? So in that sense, I think if one were cutting the government some slack, one would say that the budget is happening in the context where actually the intellectual parameters of what needs to be done, right, are not that obvious, or at least as obvious as it seems to some economists anymore. And I'll just elaborate on that in a second. The second big context is, of course, at one level, this budget emphasizes a general feature of Indian economic policy making, that despite some people proclaiming revolutions at every budget, there is more continuity than change. Changes, if they occur, are incremental. By and large, governments sort of, in a sense, have to balance macroeconomic prudence and populism. And one has to give credit where credit is due to most governments of India, except some episodes sort of late 2009 and so forth, that by and large they have not been recklessly macroeconomically imprudent, right? And that, I think, is for very good political reasons, right? Because nothing causes more political instability than macroeconomic imprudence. It's not just a kind of fetish with deficit numbers. Politicians fear inflation, politicians also fear uncertainty, and in that sense there is a kind of inherent conservatism actually built, conservatism in the good sense actually built, and I think it should give people some confidence that whatever else Indian governments might be, they are not recklessly populist. They actually seldom have been, right? I think the third sort of large kind of background fact, and I'll just kind of put this on the table in the wake of demonetization, which is that demonetization, one of the most interesting features of it was that it also signaled a decimation of whatever institutional integrity is left in India's public institutions. No matter whether you think it was a good act or a bad act, the process by which it was undertaken, the long-term damage it will do to institutional life, and you have to see it in a broader context, the way money bills are being shepherded through parliament, you know, where if you ask the question, do we have, in a sense, confidence that the procedures of the government of India as we know them, right, and procedures is what gives the state credibility and stability, will they be adhered to any longer? We don't have that. And I think this budget, in a sense, I think continues the trend of that kind of decimation. Just to take one small example, I mean, everybody used to rail about retrospective taxation under the UPA. If you think of what they have done to, let's say, investment in second homes in the housing sector, you can see it as a form of retrospective taxation, except it's on individuals, it's not on corporations and companies. So I think that ability of the state to sort of just make up stuff as it goes along, right? You know, we were supposed to have more clarity in tax rates, and I don't mind a higher tax rate, frankly, for the upper income brackets. I'm not persuaded that they need a tax cut. But I think the idea that you keep using surcharges, the idea that you keep sort of continuing with cesses, all those kinds of institutional ad hocism is in a sense likely to continue. Now to the larger political story, and I'll just make two broad remarks on this. The first story, I think, has to be seen in the framework of state-capital relations in India, right? The central political economy fact in any modern political economy is what's going to be the relationship between state and capital, or broadly what you call institutions of capitalism. Now, one of the more interesting things about this budget is the following. I think there was a perception out there, very rightly, that the last 10 years have been very good for Indian capital in one very specific way, which is that most governments have worked overtime to protect the interest of big capital, right? Think of what went on, particularly UPA 2, right? Big capital got everything it wanted. Sure, domestic interest rates may be high, but you can do external commercial borrowings. They got captive infrastructure, right? They got to renegotiate all the PPPs, right? They cornered most of the credit from Indian banks, right? And that perception, right, that the state had become beholden to big capital has led to a fundamental crisis of the legitimacy of capital in India. Let's make no mistake about it, right? Okay. Now, that crisis was expressed in two ways. One, it was expressed in the anti-corruption movements. The fear of plutocracy is still an important political fear a government has to take into account. And if you ask the question why the NPA problem is not being solved, part of the answer is that the state does not have the political capital to renegotiate with capital in a way which allows capital to take haircuts, because they're very afraid of a big political backlash, right? The NPA problem is not just an administrative problem of banking. The NPA problem is a problem of renegotiating deals between state and Indian capital, right? Now, here's the crux of the problem. The crux of the problem is that Indian capital has still not understood that the game has changed, right? Indian capital, in fact, I said it 2 years ago, that the Indian big capital and private sector has now the potential of dragging down India's economy. It is not the engine for change. It is still holding out for deals that are unviable. Just look at the real estate sector. Right? I mean, think of India's big real estate companies, Unitech, all of these guys who are supposedly declaring bankruptcy, right? So, when people say, look, what's being done about stranded assets, NPAs, all of that, I think the government is stuck. It knows it has to cut deals, but it knows it doesn't have the political cover to cut deals. It will be accused of being a suit-boot ki sarkar, right? And, let's face it, don't underestimate the crisis of big capital in India. When Mr. Ratan Tata has to grovel before Mohan Bhagwat, okay, tell me what it does to the credibility of Indian capital. Okay? Now that, I think, is the large background crisis in which some of the measures in this budget need to be undertaken. I think the signal that the focus is on small and medium enterprises, that they got a raw deal, right? That they are the ones who need to be given a tax cut. It's amazing Indian corporates with a straight face coming with a begging bowl to the government again, give us tax cuts, right? Seriously, you look at their effective rates of taxation, right? Okay? So this budget is an important signal. The good thing about it, that the focus has to move to small and medium enterprises. Now, that does pose a political problem because it does leave the big problem of state-capital relationships still unresolved. And I will submit to you that I don't think it's going to be resolved anytime soon. I don't think Indian capital is in the mood for reform. I don't think Indian capital has the credibility, I don't think Indian capital has the commitment, and I think you will see Indian big capital still looking for exit options where it can find them. Okay? So that's the one central political economy fact about large kind of capital. The second, I think, large political fact is that the government has been competent, as I said, been macroeconomically prudent. It has also undertaken some structural reforms, although most of them are the ones they opposed under UPA. So it just underscores that that continuity. But the political establishment recognizes that it doesn't have enough to go to the electorate with a triumphal economic narrative, right? Demonetization, as I said, did not yield. You can't go to the UP voters and say, look, here's something demonetization did for you right now, right? That supposed windfall gain that was supposed to materialize did not materialize, and was, it should have been clear from the start was not going to materialize, right? Job creation is extremely tepid, extremely tepid, right? So there is no triumphalist narrative that the government actually has available, right? In that sense, I think the government's caution, to me, signals it's also stuck. It's not quite sure where to move now, at least on the economic front. And when you're stuck, I think it's prudent to be prudent, right? At least after giving the economy one shock, don't try and do something that in a sense is reckless. But the fact that it is stuck, I think, means that the political space is actually going to open up again. It's not surprising that the UP and Punjab elections are turning out to be quote-unquote normal elections. We don't know what the result is going to be, but they're normal elections in the sense that they're not subject to any waves, they're not subject to any kind of triumphal single-minded narratives, and in fact, the BJP is very much keeping all the balls alive, in terms of low-level communal mobilization in UP, discussion about sort of anti-Romeo squads, all of the normal sort of panoply of mobilizational techniques, right, are going to be, we are back to politics. I would submit that if the economy continues this way, right, you're probably going to be back to, I think, 1977 actually, in terms of both how the state has just reacted on the economy, but in terms of what kinds of coalition forces are actually going to emerge to oppose the state. So the political field, I think, despite Mr. Modi's personal popularity, is going to be extremely open, and I think this budget is a signal of that there just ain't no triumphalist economic narrative at all, which they can actually take to the public. Last and final comment I'll just make on the, on the politics and sort of institutional side, which is, we can talk about lots of sort of different aspects of the budget. As Yamini has written, I think in the social sector, by and large, there's more continuity. In fact, there's almost kind of a stasis, right? Now, to my mind, that's not good news for the Indian economy. On health and education, this government is a walking disaster, like previous governments have been, right? And if you want a competitive India, not just a competitive India, but if you want to make economic impact on the ground, right? Inflation in these two sectors is the highest. People's sense of well-being is measured, I think, most now probably in terms of expenditure in these two sectors, right? The continued and unconscionable failure even in year 3, right? In fact, I'd go further. I think there is, despite Mr. Jaitley's announcement of UGC reform, if you look at every single action this government has undertaken in the last 3 years, it's a net decimation of Indian higher education, right? So it does signal, right, to me that I think their priority is going to, in a sense, not, as it were, they don't see health and education as long-term building blocks of a competitive economy. The calling card for 2019 is going to be the housing sector. Right now, the housing sector, the politics makes perfect sense. Everybody wants their own home. It could potentially give a stimulus to the Indian economy. It's extremely popular. I mean, sort of whatever little evidence we have. And the big push to housing, low-cost housing in this budget, I think to me indicates that for 2019, this calling card that we gave everybody house, and by the way, that's again a continuation of Indira Awas. Probably you would have been in the same place with the UPA, but all construction is actually going to be the only sort of calling card I think this government has, right? But here's the political question to ask. Almost 3 years, 2.5 years into this government, you are still dependent on the state expenditure to be pulling the leading strings of the Indian economy, right? I mean, this sounds like back to 70s. You know, we thought we'd left that behind in 1991. If that does not signal a political and institutional failure, I don't know. And I don't see anything in this budget that will help overcome that, at least in the next year and a half, 2 years. Best case scenario for private investment pickup is probably 2 years, right? Which means, last point, that you will get lots of social conflict. Brace yourselves. In India, we don't see it because it gets itself expressed in different ways that we don't often relate to the budget directly. But you have all of the Northeast burning right now. The fact that you can have Jat agitations, Jallikattu, all of that, right? It's to me a sublimation of an underlying disquiet that is not being channeled through the political process, right? And the fact that we are not recognizing it, and the budget is not even recognizing it, does not bode well for social stability over the next 2 to 3 years.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a very somber message, probably bringing us down to the terra firma. Since you did not take your full allotted time, let me ask you 2 quick questions. If the new narrative on the state-capital relationship is what you are outlined so well, what does it mean for this government's Make in India program, which is largely dependent on the big business coming forward and expanding their space? That's number one. And number two, as a political scientist, do you fear or foresee some sort of miniaturization of India's big business? Because the focus is on the MSME sector, and there is a built-in incentive for the big business probably to take advantage of the situation of an incentive in the below 50 crore category. So big business is not good, so therefore become small. So as a political scientist, what's your sense?
So 2 questions. So first on the narrative, the Make in India question is a very good question actually. So look, like with a lot of narratives in this government, there is a slogan and then there's the reality. And very frankly, the actual signals are very contradictory to the slogan being pronounced. So just take this budget, right? So you have this big digitization push, right? Now, whatever you may think of digitization, you know, creating a cashless digital economy, right? You want all of these machines to come up, ATM machines, pay points, all of that, right? How are you going to do that very quickly? You're basically going to import them, right? Make in India? You've just given, you know, you're going to announce with great fanfare, Apple setting up a, plant in Karnataka, right? Right? With the most unheard of concessions that you are actually, in fact, the whole point was supposed to create a regulatory level playing field. We are now back into a world where, hey, gee, I want Apple in, I'll give them some concession, but you know, Samsung was here of its own accord, so you will get penalized, right?
That's right.
So, Make in India is not, I don't see a regulatory framework under Make in India. Now, the buy-off with big capital is going to be defense. That's basically the state capital deal, right? Which is, these guys are not going to produce globally competitive products. These guys are not going to become the next, you know, consumer-oriented multinational. These guys are going to, again, hang on to the coattails of the state, right? Right? Through the defense industry, right? And that's that's in a sense the equilibrium. Big capital doesn't have that leadership anymore, right? It doesn't have even the icons anymore, right? So in that sense, I mean, I would not in this audience underestimate the social crisis that big capital is facing, because it also then cuts down the government's room for maneuver, right? Yeah. It's one thing to say we are helping a vibrant, clean capitalist class interested in reform. It's another thing to say that we are helping a class that basically is the first one to come to the state crying for handouts every time it miscalculates and misassesses risk, right? And I think the government is seeing that, which is why I'm not very optimistic that this NPA thing is going to be resolved anytime soon. Because this much any politician understands, right? A 2% haircut to company X is not going to make for a very nice headline in the newspaper, and that's where the negotiation is stuck. Otherwise, it's not rocket science, right? You just get a bunch of negotiators, you figure out, you know, what makes a project viable. I mean, so it is like with China, right? I mean, in some senses where you can say there's a structural contradiction between the interests of the party and a kind of debt-fueled economy. There is at the moment, a insurmountable structural contradiction in state-capital relations in India, and it's not going to be easily resolved, right? Which is why I don't see the private sector sort of, I mean, I think that great institutional impediments to the private sector take it. Now, whether they can arbitrage this kind of miniaturization thing, I mean, I suppose it depends on the industry and the cost and, economies of sort of scale, a scale thing. But I think, to be fair, the finance minister did say that at least on tax rates, you've actually brought the MSME down to the big corporates rather than actually giving them a big concession, whether that's true or not,
going with the effective rate.
Right, effective rate. I mean, that arbitrage possibility always exists.
Okay, thank you.